Now, last week we talked about prehistory, and this week the module deals with Japanese and Chinese art culture. Before we get into that, was your week last week? Or
Just
since
busy
the
with a ton of homework.
well, good. It's nice to be busy. You get in less trouble that way. Do you have any questions about the assignments or anything?
No, I don't.
Okay, good. There have been a couple questions and things that happened that I wanted to address. Number of people have been letting me know that sometimes the rubric doesn't match with the assignment description, and I really appreciate it when people tell me that because, like I said, I'm a beta tester for Brian Isles' classes that he's put together, and although I try to catch it, I can't catch everything. So I really appreciate it when people point that out to me. And everybody who has so far has been really nice about it. Another thing I wanted to mention is that when the assignment calls for somebody to take a photo of their notes, do you remember the assignment in Divergent Thinking where you were supposed to write down your brainstorming and then submit a photo of that?
Yes.
Yeah, and that is perfectly fine. When the assignment asks for a photo of your writing, that's great. But everything else, there's been a couple of people who have turned in photos of handwritten notes and things. If the assignment doesn't say handwritten, everything needs to be typed. And I think we've spoken about this a couple times, but in things like attendance and reflections, it really needs to be typed. That way, it's a lot easier to read. But I'm sorry that I'm poking in my eye because there's something in the air here, and I don't understand exactly what it is. What we're going to be doing for the next couple weeks is addressing bits and pieces of the artist research project we talked about a couple weeks ago, as well as every week we'll be visiting a different part of the world, just doing a quick examination of art from that area. Uh, um, do you remember the four steps of artistic critique, the four tools that we talked about a couple weeks ago, several weeks ago?
Is it describe, analyze, interpret, and evaluate?
Yes, perfect. Exactly right. Those are guides that we're using to help us filter everything through a lens of critical thinking so we can think on purpose. So when we look at art, for example, cave art from last week or from wall paintings from this week, what I want us to be able to do is describe it to ourselves. And you can even look at the image and pretend that you're describing it to somebody who's not there. Think about how the person or the artist made it, and then kind of imagine what they were trying to communicate to you with their making it. And then ask yourself, is it successful? Most of the images, if not all of them, that we'll be showing are successful because they've stood the test of time. But we may not be exactly comfortable looking at some of them. The aesthetics that we're used to in our culture, the aesthetics that we interact with, that we're used to, that we're comfortable with, are not necessarily there for other cultures. Sometimes some features, um, some distortions of the human body are necessary for whatever culture is recording, or they're important to whatever culture is recording, and it makes us feel uncomfortable or a little bit cringy, and that's perfectly fine. Uh, when we evaluate something that comes from other cultures, what we need to be thinking of is not whether or not they met our expectations, because that is completely unimportant to them. Well, we need to ask ourselves, what can I learn about their cultural expectations, and are they meeting them? Does that shift in perspective make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah, it does kind of make sense. There have been some people that I've heard, and I don't know. I'm a firm believer that opinions are like armpits. Everybody's got a couple, and it's one of those things where just because someone has an opinion, it not necessarily doesn't necessarily mean you have to shout it to the world. And some of those kind of, and we all know those kind of people. You know, we all have interacted with them, and sometimes every once in a while we get tired ourselves, and we're guilty of that as well. But sometimes people get really bent out of shape and upset because they look at how people have done things in other cultures in previous times and try to evaluate them by the times and scales that we use today to evaluate. And that simply just isn't doesn't work. You know, if we look at one of the robotic chess machines being built in the Middle East and Europe between during the Renaissance, between 1300s and 1600s, we can look at that and say, "Oh, that's very crude." But what people don't understand is that that's the first time in the history of the world, outside of the Greek myths, when somebody has even thought about constructing a robot, let alone actually done it. Yeah, it did have limited uses, but it wasn't designed to solve everything. It was created and was an absolutely technological miracle. So one of those things is I believe it was in I want to say 13th, 14th century um, Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, with the invention of there was a rabbi who invented an alcohol engine that was nicknamed the Golem, and it was an alcohol engine that he attached to a cart, and he would move things around the city of Prague on this alcohol-driven cart. And we say, oh yeah, it's primitive and everything like, but that was, you know, that was 600 years before um, what's his face Ford was even a glimmer in his parents' eyes. Or 1,000 years before that, we get the Greek Huron, who created a steam engine. You know, it's yes, again, it was primitive, but that was something that the world had not seen up to that time. So I think it helps to, as we examine world art and art through the ages, we look at it as best we can through a lens where we're asking ourselves, what would the world be like if I lived there or if I lived in that time? You know, what would I see around the world? Um, another example might be it's astonishing to me how the people looked uncomfortable in a lot of these European portrait paintings, but it was amazing to me how clean they looked because there were some people that prided themselves living their entire life not ever having submerged in water. You know, and just so we've got to look at, yeah, it's gross to us now, but at that time it was considered a sign of piety, if you can believe that. That just makes, tell me you're shuddering, Addison.
Very much.
Well, have you had a chance at all to visit the module for this week about Japan and China and then revisiting the module 3?
I did a little.
Okay, good. What we're looking at is just some painting, some art from Japan and China. And one of the problems when we do this kind of rapid survey is in the history of the world, there may have been as many as 165 billion people that have been born and lived out their lives. And all of them made something. All of them left at least a tiny mark, if not more. And so there's absolutely no way if we look at history of art around the world that we can really show any sort of a comprehensive window on any of the records of creation that our ancestors have made, because these are our ancestors. I mean, at the very least, the farthest we are related from anybody is a 50th cousin, which means that 50 generations back, our families cross paths. And so, these are our ancestors that we're looking at, even though we feel we may never have spoken their language and we don't know their stories very well. But I think that's one of the things that's kind of fun about seeing art from around the world, knowing that these people are related to me too. Japan and China have both produced profound art in several different periods of construction. Uh, the the Qin emperors created a. I was taught in school that Henry Ford was the first one to create an assembly line, but one of the earlier assembly lines was in the Qin dynasty, which is centuries and centuries ago, where somebody could make a trigger guard, somebody else could make a triggering mechanism, and somebody else could make a crossbow stock. And these guys could be 300 miles away from each other, never even knew that the other person had ever been born. And anybody could take these three things and fit them together, and they would fit perfectly. They were able to do this because of very strict awareness of dimensions and a of the products that they were building, and making sure that the same measuring tools were used by everybody involved in the process. So they had a system, a very strong, it was very strongly geared towards military endeavors, but they already had a, a conveyor belt kind of system of construction uh, that they were using at the very formation of China as a country, which I think is really amazing. But what we're going to be talking about is just really briefly some of the influences of Japanese painting, and this is generally for the medieval period. And we're going to be looking at an artist from the 16th century, and uh, looking at the national painting style of China, which it was heavily influenced by Confucianism and is considered now to be one of the highest types of art that anybody could aspire to. And I met a few years ago while I was teaching at BYU, I met a gentleman who was at that time the youngest painting master in China in this particular style. But in Japan, uh, Addison, do you know what the major religions, pre-Christian religions in Japan were?
I do not.
Okay, these have heavily informed how the Japanese um, art styles that we associate with that country came about. And that was primarily Shinto, and later it was Buddhism. But Shinto is an ancient religion, and it deals with something called kami. And kami is a word that means essentially non-human spirit. And these could be also thought of as gods or a representation of the divine presence. But kami is a way of relating to the things, objects, and events that surround a community or that interact directly with the human being. The kami or these spirits could be present in living and dead things, organic and inorganic things. Um, they could be very strongly present in natural disasters as well as simple natural forces. So there is a kami, for example, associated with the garbage dump, as well as beautiful kami associated with the wind, the rain, flowers, maybe a particular area that a garden grows in, particular kinds of trees. Um, there will be kami that are associated with protecting, say, a graveyard, as well as kami that are associated with haunting a graveyard. So both things that are positive and negative as well. And you can see all over Japan, there's these ancient gates that mark an area that is recognized as having a particularly strong presence of kami. the the Buddhist uh, influence came along a little bit later, or quite a bit later. The Buddhism started showing up in Japan, I think, in about the fifth century or so. And a couple centuries later, there was a person of a lot of influence who wanted to show the world his dedication to the Buddha and the Eightfold Path by creating what at that time was the largest surviving bronze sculpture of the ancient world. This was a 40-foot tall bronze sculpture of the Buddha in Nara, Japan. It was called the Nara Daibutsu. But it was so big, he ran out of bronze that he could buy for as ingots from people. So he passed laws about using bronze in coinage and made everybody give their bronze to him in exchange for wood or clay um, coinage to replace it. And the reason that's important is that all the bronze in the islands of Japan was locked up in this Nara Daibutsu, and people had to develop other ways of creating permanent sculptures. And the Japanese artists, in their creative manner, uh, developed a lacquer technology that kind of replaced what had previously been sculpted out of bronze. So very creative and brilliant artists. But because of these things, and a very strong awareness of the spirituality of nature and the environment, and kind of an awareness of that kind of spiritual presence that follows along with uh, like Buddhist meditation. There is an awareness of something called wabi-sabi, which wabi-sabi means delightfully imperfect. Basically, it's the organic beauty that is around us that doesn't feel like it's quite finished, or it feels like it's starting to decay. So, Addison, from that, what do you think Japanese paintings might show? I'm talking about traditional medieval Japanese paintings. What kinds of things do you think that they would want to record in a painting?
Maybe like nature around them.
Yeah, yeah, and not just nature, but like a stylized or something infused with that awareness of importance, where um, you feel almost this divine presence. Yeah, very much. And the famous painting that is in your module is done on paper. Houses in Japan were this time period were traditionally made with very complicated wood beaming that is just from a woodworker standpoint, it's just absolutely astounding. And then the walls were made with paper. Japanese have some of the oldest paper technology in the world. Uh, but in between rooms, instead of wallpapering or painting the lath and plaster like our ancestors did in Europe, our Japanese ancestors, they would do paintings directly on the paper on the walls. And this famous painting, the person did several fans. So it was something you wouldn't probably see in a natural setting, but each of the fans have a different scene, a different aspect of nature. Some of them are close ups, some of them are landscapes, but it's fascinating to me that this artist developed that kind of idea, where this, in essence, the wallpaper was decorated with hand painted fans. And a descendant of that artist later on in Japan in the 19th century was named Hokusai. And have you seen Japanese style wave crashing in the ocean?
Yes.
I believe I may be wrong. It may have been one of his contemporaries, but I thought it was Hokusai who did the different views of Mount Fuji, and that was one of his paintings. Where if you look really closely, you can see a really tiny Mount Fuji behind the wave. But oh, I'm sorry. I think I may be wrong about that. Who painted it? But him and his contemporaries did these wood block prints based on their paintings that they did, and celebrating this kind of a beautiful awareness of nature. But the reason why I mention that is that they were used as packing paper to send trinkets to England and Europe. And of course, some of you've no doubt heard about Van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh was completely enamored by these woodblock prints from these Japanese artists that were just basically packing material. And you can look at some of these uh, woodblock prints and see how much they influenced Vincent van Gogh in his painting. So I just thought that that was fascinating. But we can see that the Japanese traditional painting from that medieval era was very heavily influenced by the worldviews of the people at the time. And we go to back to China, and there's a philosophy. You know, we think of Buddhism in China as well, but there is one particular philosopher that has heavily influenced Chinese thought for millennia. Um, do you know who that guy might be?
I do not.
Okay, it was his name is Confucius. He was the one that made these rather human, rather well, incredibly thoughtful observations about human behavior. You know, and he would talk about one of the phrases you've probably heard. Um, excuse me, is um, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. You've probably heard that before, but that actually is a descendant of an original Confucius phrase, which states that when the mother is happy, the home, uh, everything flows from the home. So he's one of these people that just made all these really astonishing observations about not just how life is, but how life should be. And Confucianism became this worldview that grew out of this very practical philosophy. But because of that, what it leads a person to be thinking about is um, an awareness of how this world that we live in is different from an ideal world, but also it also helps somebody who's an adherent to know what are the steps that I need to take to get from where we are right now to that ideal place. And there is a style of painting called Guo Hua where that idealized world is brought onto paper. Another aspect of Confucianism is doing the most with the least possible. And some of these painters, they would use just black ink on their paper, but the way that they would use the black ink and dilute it and make the clear water just barely have a touch of color, it would trick your eye into seeing more colors than is actually there. Then sometimes a little bit of red was put on it here and there, and sometimes other dyes were used too. But that those are two things that are really significant about Chinese painting that are holdovers or that are direct results of this Confucianist worldview, which are um, making images of an idealized world and using the smallest amount possible to do the most. And we'll talk about that more in just a little bit too. But um, where you see a very strong relationship to nature in Japanese painting, or traditional medieval Japanese painting, in traditional Chinese painting, you'll see a very strong reverence to nature that is reminiscent of the American Hudson River Valley School of painters. Um, but in amongst that, you'll see a lone fisherman fishing, and you'll see the fisherman's home, or you'll see other people's home, and you'll see that kind of symbol that resonates comfort in the middle of this astonishing landscape of nature. As we look a little bit again at Japan, the style of painting that we're looking at with it that idealized um, images of nature or kind of a reverence of the kami is called Rinpa. And as I mentioned, that idealized Chinese painting is called um, Guo Hua, Guo Hua. Sorry. What was amazing to me, I mentioned that I was became friends with the youngest Guo Hua master in China at the time, and it was about I want to say about 15, 17 years ago, right around there. He came to the U.S. and we were visiting quite a bit. My translator had a hard time keeping up because we would get excited and we both of us would speak really fast. It was kind of fun to watch him. But some of the things he talked about, do you remember our discussion with Albrecht Dürer about the four pillars of art?
Not really.
Okay, we talked about the four pillars of art being an awareness of the materials, making sure they're appropriate to the subject matter and use, making sure that you're aware of proportions, that your craftsmanship, that your craft is appropriate to what you're doing, and that you're inviting in that breath, that inspiration. And he was telling me that the hallmarks of the Guo Hua are, yes, this idealized landscape and those waypoints of comfort and familiarity. But he said that those same four pillars that Albert Dürer talked about were the things that an artist thought about when they were doing the Guo Hua painting. And I just thought that that was fascinating. So Albert Dürer and him, who'd never even heard of each other, were talking about very similar things in what they produced. But as you look at both of these things in this module, one thing that you're really going to be aware of is that that line is a vital part of what is being done, the line that's being drawn. There's a lot of attention being paid to the line. The brushes are the same brushes used in calligraphy for these artists from two different parts of the world. But what brings them together is that, as I mentioned, Confucianism, you do the most possible with the least amount. And there are, in the Guo Hua paintings, there are very specific brushstrokes that an artist can use. And there is a very specific limit to how long brushstrokes can be in relation to their width, uh, the kind of shapes that they can be. But it's all designed to provide a framework for the artist to essentially play within. But the same kind of it's not necessarily restricting to the artist, but it's more like having a string on a kite. Do you think that a kite could fly at all if it didn't have a string again to pull against?
No.
No, that's part of what makes the aerodynamics possible to enable lift. And this same kind of thing is true in both traditional Rinpa and traditional Guo Hua. And so for after you look it through the module and think about that with the reflection, just consider how the worldview of the artists, the worldviews of the artists impacted what they did, and think about how that's reflected in their artwork, and kind of consider what the artwork that they did means in expressing that worldview. But when you do your studio work, what you're going to be doing is paying attention to the idea, the Confucianist idea of doing the most with the littlest possible. You experimented with line quality, just like our ancestors did with the cave art last week. This week, you're going to be kind of moving that forward a little bit, excuse me, and also playing with the idea or exploring the idea of a limited color palette. In traditional, sometimes in a traditional painting, a lot of these times, um, black would be the principal pigment used, with tiny touches of color here and there, and that would be it. And this is true of both Rinpa and Guo Hua. And so in this, what I would like you to do is, for each of these paintings that you're going to be doing, use just pick two colors, and they can be contrasting, they can be um, complementary, but just pick two colors. Be aware of the line quality, and maybe even outline what your image with one color, and then fill in the color spaces with the other color. Play with things like density, and dilution, and see what you can come up with. Again, the assignment, it's more important that you're trying and you're putting in the time and following the directions than it is that you produce a masterwork. So and the directions, it may seem a little bit funny, but what you're producing is basically going to be a small scale room divider or screen, which was actually quite common in both cultures. So when you do that, if you do have questions, um, email me. A couple people have pointed out that the rubric did not match the assignment, so I changed that, and I really appreciate that. Uh, so that is, everything should be pretty straightforward, and there are examples in the module for what we're talking about. I think the biggest thing about this is, before you start, put like, open up a garbage bag and put that over the work surface you're going to be uh, working on, so you don't make a huge mess. That's going to be number one. Number two is, I would recommend everybody, for the rest of this class, get a large, super cheap shirt at Deseret Industries and put it on backwards before you start painting, and that'll be like your smock to protect your clothing. I would definitely recommend that. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is, well, first, Addison, do you have any questions about that? Or I think the assignment description will answer a lot of questions, but do you have any questions immediately about the kinds of stuff that we've been talking about?
No, I think I understand it.
Okay. Now, do you remember the artist that you picked to do your research on back in Module 3?
Um, Kiki Smith.
Okay. I really like Kiki Smith. She's one of these people that is wackadoodle, but she is really intelligently wackadoodle. I think she's pretty amazing. But what I want you to do for the artist research portion right now is, all you're going to be doing is recording the website addresses of 10 resources or sources that you could use for information. Because in another week or so, you'll revisit this and whittle those 10 down to a much smaller number. But I want you to be able to find 10. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about something called writer's bias or reporting bias, and repetition. Oh, about a little bit over 10 years ago, I was trolling the internet, searching for my own name like I often do. It's my favorite pastime. I like to search on the internet for myself at least 30 or 40 times a day. That is what we like to call sarcasm. But I was just happening to do this because it was really weird. I found my name mentioned in an Egyptian newspaper, and I thought, that is incredibly cool. And I looked it up, and they had written an article. They had found stuff on me. The reporter had found stuff that I was doing online that was Islamic art related, and he had written an article that was basically a review of the work I'd done. I thought, that is so cool. Over the next couple of weeks, more articles started showing up about me in I think it was Syria, Jordan, and Turkey. And I thought, this is incredibly awesome. And then I looked a little closer and I found out that each of them had copied the previous article, and they had just put a different title on it. And some of them had just switched the paragraphs around, but republished it online. Now, this is, I don't know if you've come across things where you've done research for a school paper where have you ever had that happen before where where you got excited because you saw three or four different sources and then you found out it was the exact same article?
Yes.
Yeah, it's frustrating, isn't it?
Very.
Yeah, well, this is something to be aware of. As you're doing research on your artist, just look out for that. And so it may take just just looking at the article really quickly. There are phrases that when they repeat, you can see that the person is just uh, moving paragraphs around. This happens quite a bit with blog articles on blogs, where somebody will post somebody else's writing on their blog, and you see that quite a bit in things like LinkedIn, where somebody will take somebody else's content and republish it, not because they're trying to say it's their own, but because they're excited about it and they want to share it with their audience as well. So that's one thing to be aware of, and we don't want uh, we in our 10 sources we want each one to be unique, so we don't want it to be repeated. Another thing to look out for is bias. Just be aware of bias. We can't avoid writing with a biased voice. That's something all of us do. But what I want you to consider is, um, let's say, for example, there's a story about wetlands in Utah. All right. We know that wetlands in some areas are at risk because of potential development. People want to build homes on it. And in other areas, wetlands are fiercely protected because there might be some ties with indigenous people property, indigenous people's habitations, or they were earmarked for um, generational access. So if you could find articles written about wetlands by somebody who built homes for a living, do you think that that would read very differently, as particularly about wetlands in an area that they wanted to purchase and build attract homes on? Would that read very differently than somebody who was really interested in camping and uh, looking at like bird watching or exploring nature? Do you think those two people would write different articles about the same subject?
Yes, they would.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're looking at article about an artist that happens to be by the artist himself or herself or their self, do you think it would read differently than an article about that artist by a company trying to sell prints of their work?
Probably.
Yeah, and that is not a bad thing. I think that it's important to get as many different perspectives as we can. And your artist, when you start looking up resources, I want you to explore at least two different search engines and look at YouTube as well. So you can find articles and videos as well. Sometimes museums will write really good articles about the artists, and a lot of that is because they want people to be engaged with the artists that they're showing, but they also want to educate people. There are also uh, art education sites that will just do bios and information about artists from that perspective. And there's artists that are asked to talk about themselves and other people that interview them and other people that go to their exhibits and shows and come away and share what they've learned or how it's changed their own worldview. So it's important to look at bias in an article, not as something to avoid, but to be aware that that is the thing that's going to color the um, the perspective of whoever's writing or filming the article or source. So it's something to be very aware of. Now, would recommend one particular place to start when you do this kind of research, and that is um, what is the one site that you are not supposed to use or cite as your source in any of the papers that you do at university. Do you remember the one site you're not supposed to use?
Wikipedia?
Yeah, exactly. But in this case, it's very important to use. Do you have any idea why?
No.
Well, at the very end of the Wikipedia article, there is a list of sources cited, and they always include links to those sources. That is excellent. So when your first stop, if you're looking up Kiki Smith, I would recommend go to Wikipedia, look up Kiki Smith, and then ignore the entire article, scroll to the bottom, and look at the sources cited and start visiting that. So I think Wikipedia is a perfect launching point for that. One of the reasons why you're cautioned against using Wikipedia as a primary source for any paper that you write is because there's no peer reviewing and there's no gatekeeping beyond membership. So absolutely anybody can write articles on Wikipedia. And I will argue that a lot of the times you find some valuable information, but then also a lot of the times there's articles there where the only thing they have going for them is good citations. So that would be my first stop. Whoever your artist is, look their name up on Wikipedia. And then once you get to the Wikipedia article about them, what do you do with it?
I don't know.
Well, you scroll to the bottom and look up the what?
A name?
The citations. All the sources that the person used to write that article, go to the bottom of the Wikipedia article and look up all those links and use that as a starting point. So you're not referencing the Wikipedia article itself, but you are borrowing their sources to go to. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, that is the last thing that I needed to talk about for this class for this week. Now, Addison, do you have any questions, or can you think of a question that somebody else in the class might have?
I can't think of any questions.
Okay. Well, if anybody does have questions, before emailing me, please go through all the steps of the module because that will answer almost everything. And then also uh, read again just the directions on what the project is, the research project is that you're doing. All you're doing is submitting, you'll be submitting uh, the 10 um, websites that you found that relate to your artist. And I think I have you write just a really brief um, 3 sentences, and I'll tell you what those sentences are. I'll find them here in just a second. Yeah, after you write those 10 list website sources, what you're going to be doing is writing something like well, you're going to be writing down the 2 search engines that you used, and one of those can be YouTube. In fact, I would really strongly recommend you also do a search in YouTube. I use Google and DuckDuckGo quite a bit, and then after you write down what search engines you used, then talk a little bit about what you noticed about some of the articles that you found, who wrote them. You know, are they done by other artists? Are they done by galleries or museums? Are they mostly informational? And I give an example of this in the assignment description. And then also uh, just write briefly about the kinds of things that you found. And what I would like you to do is, as much as possible, go through this fairly quickly and see if you can keep it down to about half an hour or at least under 45 minutes. Okay, so try not to spend a lot of time on this because essentially all you're going to be doing, finding the website, copying the URL, and putting that into the paper that you or the doc that you submit, and then going on to the next one. All right, so hopefully it won't take you any longer than about 35, 45 minutes. And again, be aware of the author bias and whether or not the articles repeat, and only use Wikipedia as a source for other websites that you can visit. All right. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
All right. Great. All right. Well, that's all I have for today. And since you don't have any questions, I think that'll be good. But I will look forward to visiting with you on next Tuesday.
Okay.
And I hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you. You too.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye.
Bye.